66 million years ago, something wiped out 75% of all life on Earth in a matter of days. Science calls that event the Cretaceous mass extinction, but that explanation only tells half the story. Because between verse 1 and verse 2 of the first chapter of Genesis there is an entire world that disappeared. A world inhabited, ruled, and destroyed before Adam existed. And the Bible keeps that secret with amazing precision. There is a creature in the sacred text that was so perfect, so close to God, that its fall destroyed an entire geological era. It is not man, it is the being that came before him, the one who ruled this planet when dinosaurs walked the earth. Most believe that the biblical story begins in Genesis chapter 1, but that is exactly what that gap wants you to think. Before Adam, before the garden, before the 6 days of restoration, there was another living world, complete and ruled by that being, in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28, verses 12 to 14. God himself describes that being with words that break the silence. You were the seal of perfection. Full of wisdom and perfect in beauty, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, gold. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones. Stop here for a moment. That text does not describe Adam. It was written specifically to describe Lucifer before his fall. That means that Eden was not created for man. It existed long before. And Lucifer was its original inhabitant and administrator. This is a truth that most religious institutions have never openly presented from the pulpit. But there is something else that almost no one notices in that passage. Lucifer did not simply play music. He himself was the instrument. The Bible says that the workmanship of his timbrels and pipes was in him. Worship came out of his being like sound comes out of a flute. He could have been the ruler of all cosmic worship, the being through which the entire creation expressed praise to God, while other angels worshipped from a distance. Lucifer inhabited the holy mountain and knew the voice of the Creator up close, not by hearsay, not by reference, but by living within that glory every day of his existence from the beginning of time. And here arises the question that no one asks. When exactly was Lucifer created in relation to the creation of the earth? The Bible answers that in a place where almost no one looks. The book of Job, chapter 38, verses 4 to 7. God asks Job with a voice that thunders from the whirlwind. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Morning stars. That is the exact title of Lucifer, and that text confirms that he was present when the earth was created. There was a story happening on this planet long before any human being existed to tell it. This confirms what Ezekiel hints at. Lucifer was not just an angel from heaven. He was the administrator of a world prior to Adam, a world full of colossal creatures that science found buried in geological strata and that the Bible knows by name. But before we get to those creatures, we need to understand how that world was destroyed, because destroyed it was, without a doubt. How someone who knew God so closely could turn his back on him and drag an entire era of creation down with him. The answer begins where every great tragedy begins, not in a battle, but within a solitary thought. Every war begins with an idea, and the most devastating war in the history of the universe did not begin with a weapon or an army. It began in the most intimate chamber of the most glorious being that God had created, in the place where not even the angels could see. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 14, verses 12 to 14, the Bible records that moment with a precision that makes the skin crawl. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground. You who weakened the nations, for you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High. 5 words that changed the history of the universe forever. I will be like the Most High. It was not a temptation that came from the outside. It was a choice that was born from within in the heart of the worship leader. The first sin of the universe was not an act committed with the hands. It was a thought nurtured in silence. And that thought became a revolution that shook the foundations of the heavenly order to its deepest depths. In the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verses 7 to 9, the Bible records what followed that thought with exact details. There was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought against them. But the great dragon was defeated. The ancient serpent called, and Satan was cast to the earth with his hosts. A third of the angels of heaven fell along with him, dragged by the pride of the most powerful being they had ever known. The contagion of Lucifer's pride was so devastating that it corrupted a multitude of heavenly beings into becoming accomplices. But here's the gap that most people overlook without stopping. In the Gospel of Lucas and chapter 10, verse 18, Jesus pronounces a phrase that stops time. I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. This is not a metaphor or a poetic figure. This is memory. Jesus was present and saw with his own eyes the exact moment of the fall. The verb he uses in the original Greek is in the imperfect tense, which indicates a continuous action, a scene that was recorded forever. The Creator witnessed in real time the fall of the most glorious being he had formed and did not turn his eyes away from that moment. Now comes the connection that no one establishes, the one that links theology with geology and sacred history with fossils. When Lucifer was expelled from heaven, he was thrown specifically onto the earth, onto the territory he administered. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, God cast the angels who sinned directly into the abyss, in the letter of Jude. Verse 6, it speaks of the angels who left their own domain, their assigned place in creation, domain. They had a physical place, an assigned territory, and that territory was precisely this planet on which we live. And here appears the great gap, the one that connects the whole story with a coherence that no theological system has fully explained. In the original Hebrew, Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 says that the earth was without form and void, tohu wabohu in Hebrew, but that Hebrew verb commonly translated as was can also, and in this context must be translated as became, the earth became without form and void. It was not how God originally created it, it was what it became after the judgment. The book of Isaiah, chapter 45. Verse 18 confirms it with a statement that leaves no room for ambiguous interpretation. God says, I am the Lord, who formed the earth and made it. He has established it. He did not create it in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. So, between Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, where God creates the heavens and the earth, and verse 2, where everything is chaos and emptiness, there is a time gap that can contain entire geological eras, millions of years of history that the text does not explicitly narrate. A world was created, was inhabited, was ruled by Lucifer, was destroyed by divine judgment, and then was restored for Adam. That destroyed world is the one that paleontology has been excavating for 2 centuries without knowing that it was reading the reverse side of the Bible, because that previous world was full of life, of huge creatures and ecosystems that no human eye ever beheld. The Cretaceous extinction wiped out 75% of all species in a geologically instantaneous period of time. Paleontologists find in the rock a line that scientists call the KPG boundary, and below it there is an entire living world. Dinosaurs of all species, megafauna, marine and terrestrial ecosystems of a complexity that we still have not finished understanding. Above that line, absolute silence, the signature of a judgment that erased an era like a page from history is erased. And yet, not all creatures of that world are foreign to the Bible. Some survived in the pages of the sacred text, in the book of Job. Chapter 40 verses 15 to 24, God speaks to Job about a creature he calls Behemoth with absolute familiarity. Look now at Behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. He moves his tail like a cedar. His bones are like beams of bronze, a tail like a cedar. No known modern animal has a tail that can be compared to a tree of those proportions. It is not the hippopotamus. It is not the elephant. The anatomical description does not correspond to any mammal that exists on the earth today. It corresponds with disturbing precision to the great sauropods, the herbivorous dinosaurs with endlessly long necks and tails. The biblical text does not describe Behemoth as something mythical or as a spiritual being. It describes it as a real animal that God made, and in the same book, chapter 41, God continues speaking about Leviathan, a water creature that sheds fire from its jaws. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line? Lamps go out of his mouth, sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. This is not decorative poetry. In nature there are insects like the bombardier beetle that project boiling liquids on the scale of a colossal reptile. That chemical mechanism could produce exactly the effect that the biblical text describes. Leviathan is not a monster of folklore. It is a creature that God describes with almost paternal pride in the book of Job. And Job understood, because Job lived in a time when those creatures were still part of the collective memory of humanity. But let us go back to the question that changes everything. Why did the sin of an angel destroy the entire physical creation? The creatures that populated that previous world did not make any decision. Behemoth did not rebel. Leviathan did not declare war on God, and yet everything disappeared with them. An entire world dragged down by the consequence of the sin of its administrator. The answer lies in a principle that runs through the Bible from beginning to end and that most have never connected with fossils. Sin defiles the domain where it is committed. The territory carries the spiritual mark of whoever rules it without possible exception. When Adam sinned in the garden, God did not only punish man, and in Genesis chapter 3 verse 17, he said clearly, "Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life." The earth itself was marked by the fall. The entire domain was defiled by the sin of the human administrator. Not only the body of man, but the territory he ruled. So, if the sin of Adam was enough to curse the earth of the post-Adamitic world, What did the sin of Lucifer do to his domain? The same thing, but on an absolutely incomparable cosmic scale. A judgment of a magnitude that geology still carries written in the rock. In the book of Romans, chapter 8, verse 22, Paul confirms that this pattern of territorial contamination is still active today. The whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. The current creation still carries the accumulated weight of Adam's fall. If the present creation still feels the weight of Adam, imagine the weight that the previous creation carried with Lucifer as absolute Lord, and now imagine how that judgment looked physically from the outside. What an observer would have seen descending upon this planet. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28, verses 17 and 18, God describes the result of his judgment on Lucifer with images of fire. I cast you to the ground. I brought fire from the midst of you. It devoured you. And I turned you to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all, fire coming from within. Reduction to ashes on the surface of the earth. This is not a metaphor for a spiritual punishment. And here appears the gap that science and the Bible share without having agreed at any time in modern history. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 4, verses 23 to 26, the prophet has a vision and describes it with a disturbing precision. I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void, and the heavens, they had no light. The fruitful place was a wilderness, and all its cities were broken down at the presence of the Lord by his fierce anger, and without form and void, tohu wabohu. The exact same words, but here in Jeremiah the context is absolutely explicit. This is the direct result of a divine judgment, not an original condition. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Does not describe the starting point of creation, it describes the arrival point of a catastrophic judgment. The state of chaos described in that verse is the consequence of the fire of judgment, not the raw material with which God began to create. And then came the silence. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, absolute darkness. It is not common darkness. It is the kind of darkness that results from the total absence of sunlight of a planet covered in ashes. It is the impact winter that scientists describe as the consequence of any catastrophic event of a planetary scale. The judgment was over, and the world was sealed under the weight of darkness and the silence of what no longer exists. But then something moves. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The Hebrew verb used here has a precise meaning. It is the same verb used to describe an eagle that hovers with attention over its young, protecting them with its extended wings. It is not passivity, it is active attention, it is deliberate care. It is a God who looks at a destroyed planet and does not turn away from it. He approaches. And what he would do next would be the most audacious act in the entire history of creation from the beginning to the end of time. Genesis chapter 1. It is not the story of a God who creates out of absolute nothingness. It is the story of a God who rebuilds what was destroyed. Each of the 6 days of creation is God undoing the chaos of judgment, layer by layer with the precision of a cosmic surgeon. He separates the darkness from the light. He separates the waters from the waters. He makes dry land appear where there was only a dark and inert ocean. He populates the sea, fills the air with birds, covers the restored earth with life. It is the exact reverse process of destruction, where there was impenetrable chaos. Now there is order, where there was absolute darkness. Now there is light, where there was emptiness. Now there is abundant life. And on the 6th day comes the moment that changes everything. The moment that makes the complete story make a sense it did not have before. In Genesis chapter 1 at verse 26, God speaks in a way he had not spoken on any of the previous days of creation. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over all the earth." Dominion. That word in the original Hebrew is the word that defines the central mandate of the existence of the human being from the beginning. God is delivering to man the dominion over the restored earth. The same dominion that Lucifer corrupted with his cosmic rebellion. And here's the gap that most do not see because they are not looking in the right place of the text in front of their eyes. Adam was not created for a new world without history. He was placed in a restored world that already had memory, scars, and a past, a world that had already been inhabited by colossal creatures, that had already been ruled by the most powerful being in the cosmos, a world that had already been destroyed by the fire of judgment and that God had rebuilt specifically for this new administrator. Adam was the new administrator of a territory with scars that he had not caused, but that he had to learn to rule with faithfulness. And there is another gap buried in verse 26 that practically no one has explained in a completely satisfactory way until today. The "let us make" of that verse, that first person plural that suddenly appears in the text, was never fully explained. For the first time in the entire narrative of creation, God does not simply pronounce something into existence with a direct and simple order. He deliberates, consults, as if the creation of man were an act of a radically different weight from everything that had come before. Because it was. Adam was not simply one more creature in the long list of creatures. He was God's answer to Lucifer's rebellion. He was the new type of being who would assume dominion over the territory that the fallen angel had corrupted with his sin of pride. And then comes the most intimate moment in the entire Bible, the moment that no other account of any religion has ever equaled. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. God did not speak Adam into existence when as he had spoken to the light, to the fish, to the stars, to the oceans, and to the continents. He bent down, formed with his hands, breathed into the dust something that did not exist in any previous creature, the nishmat chayim, the breath of life, the personal and untransferable mark of the Creator engraved inside the human being forever. No dinosaur received that divine breath, no behemoth, no leviathan, no creature of the previous world was marked in that way. But Satan also knew exactly what Adam represented in the plan that God was executing since before the beginning of time. Adam had received what Lucifer had lost, the dominion, the territory, the position, and the intimacy with the Creator. And in Genesis chapter 3 he went to the garden with a bait that was not new or original. It was exactly the same poison that had destroyed him. "You will be like God," he told the woman. The exact same words that he himself had pronounced in his own heart back in the glorious heaven. "I will be like the Most High," he had said in that inner chamber where no one but God could hear his deepest thoughts. He did not invent a new strategy for the garden. He used the poison that had killed him to try to kill man, and it worked. Adam fell. The dominion was compromised for the second time in the history of this planet. But God already had the next move prepared, a move planned before Adam existed, before the garden, before the judgment, before the war in heaven. In the first letter of Peter, chapter 1, verse 20, the Bible reveals that Christ was foreordained before the foundation of the world, the last Adam. As Paul calls Jesus in 1 Corinthians, chapter 15, would not come as an angel or as a powerful king. He would come as a man, live as a man, die as a man to undo from the inside what Satan had built from the outside. The complete line can now be seen whole. Glorious Lucifer, the war, the destroyed world, the restored earth, Adam created, Adam fallen, Christ the last Adam, the resurrection, and in Revelation chapter 21, verse 5, the final seal of the whole account. Behold, I make all things new, the same pattern from beginning to end, destruction, judgment, restoration, new creation. And now here is what all this means for you. For your personal story within this account that began before the dinosaurs, you are not an accident of evolution or a minor episode in the history of the cosmos. You are the being for whom an entire world was restored. That same God who looked at a destroyed planet, covered in darkness and ashes and said, "Let there be light," is the same one who looks at you today. That God did not leave when the first world was destroyed. He did not leave when the second world fell. And he still has not finished his work. That pattern repeats with a coherence that no coincidence can explain. Destruction, judgment, silence, restoration, new life. It is not the first time that God rebuilds on the ruins of something corrupted by the rebellion of a being created for glory. He did it when the first world was destroyed by the judgment on Lucifer, and he did it again after the fall of Adam. And the pattern that this reveals makes this question inevitable. If God restored a planet from ashes, what can he do with a life? The gap theory is not a modern invention to reconcile science and faith. It is anchored in the Hebrew text from the beginning. It is in the prophetic books, in the apostolic letters, in the first century Aramaic Targum, and in the words of Jesus himself. What science calls the KPG extinction and what the Bible calls the judgment on Lucifer describe the same event from two angles. One measures it in iridium isotopes and clay layers. The other records it in prophetic visions and declarations of divine judgment, and both point to the same result. A prosperous planet, full of colossal life, which was suddenly wrapped in total darkness. Geological stratigraphy shows that boundary clearly below the KPG boundary, a world in full epic biological activity. Above that line, the most documented extinction in geological history, and then slowly a new fauna emerging from the silence. Exactly as the biblical text describes the transition from verse 2 to 3 of Genesis, out of chaos. The voice that orders the light, each time the Bible uses "let there be light" in the context of creation. It is marking the beginning of a new order over the previous chaos. It is not poetic decoration. It is the signature of God on the act of rebuilding what sin and judgment brought to collapse. And that act of reconstruction did not end with Adam or end with Christ. It is still ongoing over this planet and over you. Each generation inherits the scars of the wars it did not start. But it also inherits the promise of the restoration that follows them. Adam did not choose to be born on a world with history, but he chose how to rule the territory that was entrusted to him by the Creator. You did not choose to be born in a world marked by centuries of fall and spiritual warfare either. But you can choose what to do from here. If this story connected something in you, subscribe to discover the mysteries that sacred history still hides.